Hello, hello, welcome to the stream, everybody. We are continuing our France game from last time, and I don't have to have any programs running in the background, so my computer should be running a bit more smoothly tonight. Where we left off, we'd won our first war against England, we had started integrating Orléans, and I need to hire a Diplo advisor because we have fallen behind. By a lot. Otherwise, just decided to do the Sunday stream on Saturday because it worked better with my schedule this weekend. Nice. I don't think I've done a Byzantine run since Skanderbeg was the best strategy. They're actually doing alright in this game. I have seen the Byzantine AI last until the very end of the game. It's always nice to see. So I think in addition to pushing the borders of France to the Rhine, I'm also going to capture Catalonia and restore Charlemagne's Spanish March. Bourgeoisie is pissed off at me, but they'll get happier over time. A pissed off middle class has never been anything but good for French monarchs, after all. I admit I haven't played around too much with the new mercenary mechanics. Let's see what's going on in the rest of Europe while I wait for this truce to expire. Interesting. I might have to try that at some point. I am a little bit of a Byzantaboo. I do love studying Eastern Roman history. So Byzantine runs are always a lot of fun for me. In EU4 and in CK 2 and 3. And ever since Hoi 4 added in the Greek path to restore the Byzantine Empire, that's been a lot of fun to do, just for shits and giggles. Alright, catching back up with technology. Usually if I'm just looking for a nice, laid-back game of EU4, I do France, kind of like I'm doing now, just to fuck around with the Leviathan mechanics and learn how they work. Very nice. And especially, they've kind of nerfed the Ottomans lately. So I think it's probably easier to do in more recent builds of the game than back in the day. Because the Ottomans definitely are not as strong as they used to be. I mean, like, I played some Russia games in an earlier build, and it wasn't even worth attacking the Ottomans pre-1700. Just because even if you outnumbered them, their armies would just shred yours until they started losing the quality of the Janissaries. Now, hopefully, we get Provence in a union, but that does not happen often. Oh yeah, no, the Ottomans are still OP. They're just not the absurdly powerful force they used to be in this game. Used to be the Ottomans were unbeatable by anyone except maybe a really beefy France or Spain, or very late game Russia. But nobody else even stood a chance against them. Yeah, it used to be you would just play the Ottomans and steamroll over the entire map. As long as it was pre 1700, your army was unbeatable, which is just not the case. I mean, some of the worst defeats in Ottoman history happened in the 15th, 16th century, where like Skanderbeg, for instance, gave them many a black eye during his campaigns. And then you have the crippling loss at Lepanto that just broke the Ottoman navy for the rest of the history of their empire. Right. They are a bit like Ming, because it's... Ming definitely got a little bit nerfed, but there's still... I wish we would actually get to see Ming collapse in on itself like it did historically. Because if you read a lot of Chinese history, you'll know that in the early days of the Ming Dynasty, they were a true powerhouse. They were an economic hub of the entire Pacific world. They sent exploration voyages out to well, it's not true for every game, but typically I see that the Ottomans have gotten really badly nerfed. But historically, the Ming in their golden age were a cultural, economic, and even to a degree military powerhouse. There's even some credibility to the claim that Zheng He, a Chinese explorer, might have found his way to California in the 15th century. I mean, the Chinese sent expeditions out to Africa, India. Yeah, I know. It's kind of ridiculous because they just imploded because basically they got one emperor who was... Now, Chinese history has a very long trend of having one horrible emperor who kind of just ruins the run for a dynasty. And I'm blanking on his name, but the Ming had theirs in about the 16th century. And he was incredibly xenophobic, and he ordered the entire fleet burned. So the Ming stopped exploring, their economy stagnated, and so did their army. And eventually the Manchu were able to invade and establish the Qing dynasty. True, and the Mandate of Heaven is a... I would argue that the Mandate of Heaven still exists to a degree in Chinese culture. It's just such an old idea. One of those things that sticks around a lot longer than it has to. Like, it's an idea past its prime, but it's so ingrained that if the government is doing poorly, it has somehow lost the favor of some kind of a divine force. And actually, that's one of the greatest ironies of it if you read into the history of Chinese communism. I mean, communism in itself is an atheistic movement, and that is true. You can't let them... The mandate is kind of an annoying mechanic to deal with. But so communism is an atheistic political philosophy. It excludes non-state power, religion being one of them. But despite that, when Mao started really trying to force the peasantry to get with the times, most of them wound up just kind of worshipping Mao as a sort of deity, which his ego probably fucking loved. The man was an egomaniac. But there were shrines to Mao in in various households in rural China throughout the 40s and 50s when he was doing his Great Leap Forward and all the horrible things the Maoists did. There's actually an excellent book on the topic called Son of the Revolution, which is the autobiography of a boy who grew up in Maoist China, and it is not an easy read. But it is a very good read. So if you are looking for an excellent book that shows the truth of Chinese communism, look no further than this one right here, Son of the Revolution by Liang Heng. I read it in college, and I cannot recommend it enough. Should be able to pick up used copies for less than what you can get it off Amazon, but really good book. And I will say I had an excellent professor studying Chinese history at Towson. He had been to China numerous times. He spoke the language very well. His focus was dynastic China, but I wound up writing both of my papers in school on the Korean War, actually. Hey, welcome to the stream. Just doing it worked out better with my schedule this weekend to do this stream on Saturday instead of Sunday. I always struggle. Innovative is good. Just that tech cost jives real well with French ideas. So I think I'm going to go with innovative. But yeah, so I actually had a very interesting discussion about the Korean War with a buddy of mine at work over the last week, and it really does not get the attention it deserves. Korea is one of the most interesting wars most people don't know anything about. It was only 3 years long. The end result was the status quo. But to a degree, it kind of went on to influence the history of the Eastern Pacific for the entire rest of the 20th century. And it's the reason why North Korea is the world's largest open-air prison, because we were very close to fully liberating Korea from communist rule. If MacArthur had actually listened to Congress and dug in along northern... the Vietnam War was significant in the U.S. for a lot of cultural reasons. I don't think I've read that one, but I think I know the book you're talking about. But yeah, so Vietnam was significant to the U.S. for a lot of cultural reasons, within the U.S. But in terms of the globe, it just showed that the U.S. Army was... that they could be driven out if you just waited them out, basically. Korea was far more significant in my view because it led directly to the Sino-Soviet split in communism, which is why the Soviet Union and Communist China after 61, 62 really did not see eye to eye. And most of the foundation of that split began during Korea and the sort of egomaniacal politics behind both Mao and Stalin during that war. And the Sino-Soviet split, it's still why China and Russia are a little... They might be friendlier than they used to be, but they're still a little wary of one another. Yeah, so Mao got a lot of material from Stalin to fight the Japanese, and then Stalin just used Mao and the Chinese communists to kind of mad dog the Americans in Korea. But beginnings of the split start with the fact that Stalin found Mao to be incredibly annoying, but thought it was more useful to have him as just an attack dog against the US in East Asia, because at this point the US had nukes and the Soviets didn't. At least not a large enough quantity of them. The Soviets had developed their first successful nuclear test at that point, but the Soviets didn't really have a nuclear arsenal capable of challenging the US until roughly 56. Well, that was it. They allied with the Soviets in in World War II, and then that alliance remained relatively stable until Korea, when Stalin grew to really dislike Mao. He just hung on to Mao as a useful tool to use against the US. But after Stalin died, Khrushchev and future Soviet governments just didn't see it as really worth it to continue shelling out resources at the Chinese, and a lot of Soviets thought Mao went way too far and was completely brutal. Like, Mao was one of those characters that only a person like Stalin could... Oh, yeah. But Mao was one of those people who only Stalin could tolerate, because even Khrushchev and the like were a bit put off by the level of brutality exhibited by the Maoists. Because if you read it, Maoism is like Stalinism on steroids. It is everything that's bad about Stalinism made even worse. See, at least when you were a political dissident in Stalin's Russia, he had the courtesy to kill you. Mao liked re-educating people, which is way creepier in my opinion. At least Stalin just shot you in the back of the head, that was it. But Mao, you were forced to go through a lengthy re-education process. So, I would imagine if Mao had died sooner, you probably would have seen the same guy take power afterwards, Deng Xiaoping. Mostly because he was the toughest son of a bitch in the CCP. Nobody remembers him because he wasn't anywhere near as monstrous as Mao. But Deng Xiaoping is actually the reason why the US and China started trading with one another, because he was far more moderate than Mao. And he was just kind of the last man standing. Because a lot of the other ones died in Maoist purges, but Deng Xiaoping was in and out of re-education camps and Maoist prisons, but they never broke him. Tough motherfucker. So my money would have been on Deng Xiaoping coming to power eventually. And see, ultimately Deng Xiaoping undoes a lot of the brutal shit the Maoists had implemented. So he kind of sets China down the path of becoming what it is today. Yeah, I mean, it is old history, so that might have happened. But I'm saying, if we look at what happened historically, Deng Xiaoping had enough of a faction behind him. A lot of the people who didn't like Mao rallied behind him, even during Mao's reign. And it's just that Deng Xiaoping was the toughest motherfucker that Mao had ever tried to break, and he wasn't able to. Oh, I would agree. That really started the shipping all the jobs overseas to China to take advantage of cheap labor in a government that's fucking awful. See, Communist China proves the age-old adage that you can get a lot of shit done if you don't give a single shit about human life. If you just don't care what the human consequences are, you can do a lot of things very quickly. It's horrifically evil and everyone's going to hate you, But when you have a worldview like any kind of a hardcore collectivist totalitarian worldview, the human cost doesn't matter anymore because the individual ceases to exist. And as Stalin said it best, a million deaths is one death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic. I mean, true, they did. But, I mean, it also worked in Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia. If you get a hardcore enough totalitarian government that has enough popular support, they'll do a lot of crazy shit really fast. Granted, it's the problem with any totalitarian form of government, or any utopian form of government, which is they're always one corpse away from utopia. They're always one political dissident crushed away from a perfect world. They're always one ethnic minority suppressed to achieve true communism or true fascism or whatever the fuck. But it never ends because the utopia is unattainable. So the pursuit of it never ends, and there's always just some new person or a group of people to blame for why you haven't achieved utopia. Now, mercifully, systems like that usually collapse in on themselves relatively quickly. Like, see the Soviet Union, it just kind of fell apart internally. It couldn't sustain itself. Had Nazi Germany continued on for longer than it did historically, it probably would have collapsed in on itself. Sort of like how the Soviets did. I mean, totalitarian, utopian ideologies, they tend not to last very well in the long term. Because again, when you're trying to create the perfect world, you just keep killing people until you get there if you're one of those ideologies. So it just doesn't end, and eventually people get fed up with it. So, any politician trying to sell you utopia is someone you should never listen to. If a politician promises to make a perfect world, that is someone you should never, ever, ever let get anywhere near power. And yeah, you could see the cracks in the Nazi government even before the end of the war. Exactly. Yeah. You notice this when you see some of the Wehrmacht defecting at the end of the war and fighting against the SS units. And the SS were the true believers in Hitler's just fucking batshit ideas. So those were the true ideologues. Most of the Wehrmacht didn't want to be there any more than their American counterparts did. I mean, most of them were just drafted. They were just regular ass people. Especially at the end of the war, most of them did not want to be there. So, if they got a chance to defect against a collapsing government, they would. See Josef Gangl and the battle for Schloss Itter in Austria. Well, Himmler was a guy who was it made Hitler look sane by comparison. Himmler was if Himmler was fucking batshit. Nah. There we go. There we go. Yeah, he was a mad dog among mad dogs. Like, even Hitler thought he went too far sometimes. And if a guy like Hitler thinks you're going too far, then Jesus Christ, you're going way too fucking far. But actually, it's in the battle for Castle Itter is a really interesting story. Um, it's the only time during World War II that German and American forces fought on the same side of the same battle. And basically, a group of Americans were trying to rescue French prisoners being held in this Austrian castle. And they got pinned down by an SS division, and a group of Austrian resistance fighters and Wehrmacht defectors joined them and fought the SS. Yeah, no, the Nazis are like the perfect villains in history, but they were snappy dressers. You got to give them that. Granted, that's what happens when you contract Hugo Boss to design all your uniforms. Something modern Hugo Boss would really much rather you forgot about what they did. Same story with BMW, Mercedes, and especially Volkswagen. They'd rather you forgot exactly what they were doing from 1939 to 1945. But you are correct. Like, looking cool does help your propaganda efforts, so it did the Nazis some good to have snappy uniforms. Yeah, they were sharp dressers, but they also kind of worked villainy into their uniforms. Like, they looked like bad guys. They were just sharp dressed bad guys. And actually, the helmet design, the Stahlhelm, which actually was developed during World War One, it's just become synonymous with World War Two because it was completely standard issue by that point. It was only issued to some units during World War One, but come World War Two, the Stahlhelm was standard issue for the German army. It's such an effective design. It's actually the underpinning of pretty much every modern army infantry helmet. It's just a very effective shape at deflecting bullets. So they all kind of borrow from the Stahlhelm's shape and rough design. It was just a very well designed helmet that was good at what it was meant to do. And also, yes, Nazi archaeology. And actually, if you read about some of the sort of spiritual side, and it feels really weird to say that, but some of the more spiritual, esoteric forms of Nazism, it is fucking bananas. Those people were nuts. They realized that the Indiana Jones movies were not that far off from what the Nazis were actually trying to do with some of their archaeology and occult projects. I mean, you had the Thule Society. You had a wing within the SS that was devoted to occultism. It was crazy. All right. Ooh, this is a good opportunity to strike at Brittany. So that's exactly what I'm gonna do. More or less. A lot of higher up Nazis had a serious hard on for Germanic paganism. Not all of them, some of them were Christians, but a lot of them did have a real boner for Germanic mythology and paganism. Um, so there was a big interest in occultism, and some of them believed in some really bizarre supernatural stuff. So I think eventually the plan, if I'm remembering correctly, was to kind of phase out if the Reich had been successful, was to phase out Christianity and replace it with a form of Germanic paganism. Now, I don't think that would have worked very well because Christianity at that point kind of underpinned the idea of a nation of Germany, because prior to Christianity, the German peoples were a loose group of tribes who all spoke similar languages. And yeah, it was very twisted, but it would have been a form of Germanic paganism, at least the sort of old religion of the Germanic peoples. But Germany as a country, the Germany that Hitler came to power in, wouldn't exist were it not for Christianity, because Germany arose out of the eastern part of the Frankish Empire, which united the Christian territory in Europe. But East Francia became Germany, and then Germany conquered Italy and became the Holy Roman Empire. So most of German history, at least as a German nation, it relies very heavily on Christianity. And a lot of more modern German nationalism had to do with Protestantism, because they were the birthplace of the Protestant Reformation. And German Lutheranism was very much the dominant religion, to the point where the Kulturkampf of Otto von Bismarck was mostly aimed at sort of de-Catholicizing Germany's south. And yeah, the neither holy nor Roman nor an empire bit is kind of interesting. But yeah, that was the Pope's attempt at having a temporal ruler he could use as a stick to bludgeon his enemies, but it didn't really work all that well for him. But Germany as we know it today wouldn't exist were it not for East Francia and Christianity. So Germany as a unified nation relied very heavily on Christianity, like reaching back into the earliest precursors to the German state as it exists today. Yeah, that is arguable. And I would honestly argue it was an empire, at least at some points during its history. Because during, like, the Hohenstaufen dynasty and a handful of others, it was relatively unified. And pretty cohesive as an empire. Most of what we think of as the Holy Roman Empire is the very late dying Holy Roman Empire. We don't really think of it in its heyday all that often, like the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, when it was the power in continental Europe. And I mean, the main reason Charlemagne even got the title of Holy Roman Emperor is because or rather Emperor of the Romans, is that he united most of what had been the Western Empire for the first time since 476. And that is true. So actually that brings me to a very interesting historical point, which I'm actually going to be getting into in the next few episodes of the podcast. When Rome becomes Christian, a lot of its old republican ideas are phased out completely, because there gets to be this idea that temporal power should imitate divine power. So as there is one God and one court in heaven, so too should there be one emperor and one empire on earth. So the empire just referred to Rome. So Charlemagne did a lot of that stuff, but a lot of the sort of Latin and Greek works in Western Europe were preserved already in monastic culture, a lot of which actually happened in Ireland. So during the initial phase of the medieval era, about the century immediately following the end of the Western Empire, the Christians in Ireland, who were actually Christianized by Christian Celts in Britain, because Ireland was relatively on the fringe of Europe, not just in Dublin, all over Ireland, But because it was on the fringe of Europe and there were no real naval entities that could strike at it, Ireland became a hotbed of very peaceful monastic life. And Irish monks were instrumental in preserving the Roman world. Like, this is when the Book of Kells was written, which is just gorgeous. And if you ever get the chance to go to Dublin, go to Trinity Library and look at the Book of Kells. It is beyond beautiful. But monks in Ireland in particular, but also in Britain, did a hell of a lot in preserving the sort of old Roman knowledge. There were plenty of monasteries in continental Europe, but continental Europe was much less stable in this period than Ireland in particular, because the Celts in Britain were dealing with the Anglo-Saxon invasions roughly at that point. So Ireland was where a lot of this knowledge was recorded and kept. And then later you have a sort of Anglo-Saxon intellectual revival in the Kingdom of Northumbria. Actually, Northumbria was so renowned for its intellectual culture and monasticism that many of Charlemagne's top advisors were from Northumbria. The most famous being Alcuin of York, who was just a brilliant monk of his day. So he came to Charlemagne's court to do honestly some of the best work of his life. And he was a major advisor to Charlemagne. Alright, so I can't call Scotland in on this one. But it shouldn't be that much trouble to deal with Brittany and Portugal. Oh, in the modern world, well, there's a meme that Finland is the true inheritor of the Roman legacy, but, who has the Roman legacy? I would say it depends on what you look at when you think of Rome. So, France, Italy, and Spain inherited its linguistic legacy. If you're looking for sort of the global peacekeeper, or the main global superpower, it's probably the US. Russia claims to be the third Rome as well. It's really a matter of perspective and what you look at when you think of the Roman Empire. I can tell you, as someone who is relatively well versed in the founding of the United States, the founding fathers here had a serious hard-on for the Roman Republic and actually based a lot of the American government on the Roman Republican system. So the US has a claim to being sort of a descendant of Rome in a way. The French and Spanish and Italians all do. But honestly, the Vatican City is like, and the Catholic Church in general, is one of the last vestiges of Western Rome in the world. Hell, even the Turks made a claim to being the inheritors of Rome. It's an empire whose power in its own day, just everyone wanted a piece of that legacy. So I wouldn't say there's any country in the modern era that is a good parallel to Rome, but I would say that historically the empire that had the most legitimate, Greece too, they were though more in the Eastern Roman sense. And the other thing you got to consider here is Rome was always internally divided between a Latin West and a Greek East, even to the early days of the empire, where in the East, Greek was always one of the more commonly spoken languages over Latin. So I would say historically the most legitimate claimant to the Western Empire would have been actually the HRE, because it had the assent of the Pope, who was the last vestige of the old Roman government. And then obviously the most legitimate claimant to the Eastern Roman title was Byzantium, at least until it fell in 1453, and then I would say Moscow, Russia, was the most legitimate claimant to the Eastern Roman Empire. And up until 1917, I would say Russia had the most legitimate claim, but I don't think the Romans would have really jived with what the Soviets were up to, so I think that got forfeited during the revolution. And again, if you want an heir to see the sort of republican tradition of Rome, I would honestly say it's the United States. But in Western Europe, really nobody. And honestly in Eastern Europe as well, these days. In the past, it was a different story, but these days... Well, there are a lot of parallels between the decline of Rome and the decline of any other given republic. But it happens. Governments go... I operate on a theory that much like individuals... I could go along with that, at least for the Eastern Rome. At least Greece as an independent nation. And I only say Russia after 1453 because Greece was under the rule of the Ottomans for a long time. So I would say post 1453 Russia had a pretty decent claim to being the Third Rome. Yes, he was. And I think for a while that was just a title that was tacked on to what the Byzantine emperors styled themselves as. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But I know the term King of the Greeks was used for a long time to address the Byzantine emperor. Especially by Kaisers of the HRE, because they resented referring to the emperor in Constantinople as a equal to them, and vice versa. Actually, if you read into the history of the Third Crusade, there is this whole funny exchange where Kaiser Friedrich Barbarossa of the HRE and the name of the emperor at the time escapes me in Byzantium, were arguing with each other over who addresses who as emperor, and it wound up delaying Friedrich Barbarossa's entry into the Holy Land. And also, yeah, I am familiar with their and I would say especially immediately after World War I and sort of the turn of the century, shortly after Greek independence, I would say the Greeks had a very legitimate claim, and arguably still do, to a lot of what is now Western Turkey, because a lot of this was still ethnically Greek into the 40s and 50s. I mean, Smyrna down here, a huge number of Greeks lived there. It was actually a majority Greek city, if I'm not wrong. But a lot of that changed with the Armenian genocide, which was also a genocide of Greeks and Assyrians within sort of modern-day Turkey. Yep, that is another one that is a lot of people aren't familiar with, but the Megali idea, there was a movement to reclaim Byzantium. And yeah, Pontic Greeks are an ethnic group that was a lot of these sort of native Greeks of Anatolia were either deported or killed during the Armenian genocide. The Assyrians were almost driven to the point of extinction, and, well, the Armenians were also almost driven to the point of extinction. The Armenians used to be a lot more numerous than they are today. But the Turks got away with it is the thing. Nobody calls them on it these days. Not many nations actually acknowledge that the Armenian genocide happened. Pisses me off to no end. It was a successful genocide. They actually managed to eradicate pretty much all non-Turks in Turkey, well, except for the Kurds. The Kurds are still around, although the Turkish government will tell you that they're mountain Turks, which is a load of bullshit. I mean, people think of the Ottoman Empire as like just most other like brutal imperialistic forces, but they did far less ethnic cleansing than the Young Turks regime, which honestly, the fact that that news organization calls itself the Young Turks just shows you everything you need to know about them, because that is a legitimately genocidal regime they've named themselves after. Because it wasn't the Ottoman government that carried out the Armenian genocide, it was the Young Turks regime that toppled it. Because while the Ottoman Turks got a lot wrong, well, keeping Turkey happy, remember Turkey's part of NATO, and especially during the Soviet era, having Turkey as an ally was useful against the Soviet Union. So you kind of had to keep the Turks happy if you wanted to keep missiles right in the Soviet Union's backyard. So, for the majority of the Cold War, and actually, let me pull up a map of this. I might be wrong. Here we go. Okay, so yeah, these are the countries that recognize the Armenian genocide, that recognize that it happened. Yeah, like the Janissaries were an atrocity, but they weren't, you know, ethnically cleansing entire regions like the Young Turks were. Those guys were genocidal lunatics. And honestly, I think the Ottomans get too glowing a review in modern history, at least in the U.S. In the U.S., we were taught that the Ottomans were good guys, even though they really fucking weren't. They were just as brutal as any other empire throughout history, arguably more so. But there are a large number of countries that just don't recognize that the Armenian genocide even happened. Britain honestly surprises me. There is actually a fairly large Armenian diaspora in the U.S., so I understand why we definitely recognize it. And the Greeks, Bulgarians, Syrians, Armenians, obviously, they all make sense. A lot of the Assyrians were almost driven to extinction. Like, there aren't many of them left, and a large part of that is due to the Armenian genocide. I know, and that pisses... Cenk Uyghur's a fucking idiot. And he is an Armenian genocide denier. He likes to pretend it didn't happen, or that it didn't happen in the way that it actually happened. Meanwhile, I've actually read reports of the Turkish Navy sinking ships full of women and children. Entire villages eradicated overnight because they were A, Christian, and B, not Turkish. The only reason the Kurds survived to a degree was that they're a Muslim minority. But even then, the government in Ankara refuses to acknowledge that they exist. If you ask the Turkish government what a Kurd is, they'll call them a mountain Turk. It's one of the greatest atrocities of the 20th century, and they got away with it. And actually, there were some young German military personnel in Anatolia during the Armenian genocide who got a lot of their ideas for the Holocaust from what the Turks were doing to the Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks. In particular, the death marches. There's one particularly galling incident where thousands of Armenian civilians were marched at gunpoint through the open desert until they either starved or died of thirst. Brittany. Let's get them out of the war so we can just focus on Britain. I'll take a nice chunk of change from you. War reparations. There we go. But no, the Assyrians almost went extinct during the Armenian genocide, and again, I think there's fewer than a couple 100,000 of them alive today, because they're a Christian minority. And at least the Greeks during the Armenian genocide had a Greek nation to fall back to. Armenia was entirely within the Ottoman Empire, so they had nowhere to flee to. Same story with the Assyrians. Well, that's politicians anywhere. Politicians are collectively the most useless group of people in the world. They don't do anything useful. As evidenced by the fact that most countries hate their own politicians. Alright, I'll take all of that money, please. No, go to hell, Austria. Yeah, the Romanovs did claim that the Russian Empire was the Third Rome. Or actually, it was the Rurikovs who first claimed it. Largely because one of the Rurikovs married one of the last of the Paleologoi, who were the last Byzantine dynasty. There we go. Well, that was a pain to siege. And now we can surround the English and destroy them. But I will tell you, as someone who grew up in American schools, the Ottomans get a pretty glowing review, because religious tolerance, but they ignore, a lot of the rest of the shit they were doing. Never mind the fact that the Dutch were far more religiously tolerant, or that the ancient Persians were as well. They were an interesting dynasty, and it would have been nice to see what they could have done with an empire that wasn't already pretty much dead by the time they inherited it. That's the thing, is like, I mean, what could Constantine the 11th have actually done? Because by the time he inherited the empire, it was little more than a city-state. You had Constantinople proper, which at that point was a shell of its former self, and then you had Morea, the Peloponnese, and what can you even do with that? Especially when you're completely surrounded by an empire with a very effective military that wants to eradicate you. Because Mehmet the Conqueror wanted to take Constantinople to do what no other Muslim conqueror had done, and seize the greatest, and Athens. Athens was also part of the Byzantine Empire, but still, they were completely surrounded on all sides by a very hostile state that wanted nothing less than the eradication of their empire. It's sort of like Alexios Komnenos inherited an empire that was beaten but not yet broken. Like, he still had a chance to take back parts of Anatolia, and Constantinople was still enough of a powerhouse of a city that even without Anatolia, he could still raise a pretty serious fucking army and had a really good economy. But by the time the Paleologoi came to power, there wasn't much of an empire left. It had been destroyed by centuries of attack from Arabs and Turks, and the disaster that was the Fourth Crusade. And if I remember correctly, Athens at that point was one of the sort of states that fractured out when Constantinople fell to the Fourth Crusade. Oh, they did, but at that point, by the time they'd reformed it, the Ottomans were already really picking up steam. And no, just don't get me wrong. The Paleologoi were undoubtedly a very impressive dynasty. But what I'm saying is, when they inherited the empire, it was already almost on death's door. They kept it going a lot longer than it probably would have without them. But by the time they'd inherited the empire, there wasn't a whole lot anyone could do. The Ottomans were a big part by the time the Paleologoi really had gained full control of the of what was left of Byzantium. But you have other powers in the region. You briefly have the Serbian Empire show up. Byzantium was in a very bad way when the Paleologoi came to power. And they managed to stabilize it and restore what they could, but they also had to deal with the Serbians, with Venice. Venice was a real problem because they rivaled them at sea, which had historically been one of Byzantium's strong points. And then you have a rising Ottoman Empire. So they did as well as anyone could have, honestly. I can't think of I can't think of anybody who could have done better because they managed to preserve the empire for a very long time. Considering the state it was in. Also, yes, the French were very effective during the Crusades. I mean, they did a whole series on them. Most of the Crusades that were actually successful were led by Frenchmen. Alright, I'm gonna focus in on Diplo because I am falling very far behind. You're honestly not wrong. Although I would argue they're far closer to the Portuguese or the Dutch in terms of the structure of their empire. So if you'll notice what the Portuguese and the Dutch did when they went out colonizing, they didn't really seize large swathes of land because they didn't have the manpower to do it. But they did have the navy to maintain a large number of small naval forts along the coast that they could use to direct trade as they wanted. The British Empire was sort of what the Portuguese or Dutch would have done if they'd had Britain's manpower. Because Britain actually had the manpower to found settler colonies like the 13 colonies, Canada, South Africa, Italy, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So, sorry, I didn't, brain's fried, didn't mean to mention Italy. But I would say Venice is a lot closer to what the Dutch or the Portuguese were up to than what the British were up to. Because neither Portugal nor the Netherlands really had the manpower to establish large, successful settler colonies. Dutch South Africa being a big exception to that. But largely the Dutch focused on controlling trading posts and coastal forts. And really the Dutch took over what had been the Portuguese Empire during the Napoleonic, or during the Iberian Union. So which was the best colonial empire? That's a tough one. I would say the British or the Spanish. The Spanish laid the groundwork for what all other colonial empires would be, and the British turned out to be the best at it. So, I would say because the Spanish have an entire continent speaking their language, largely because of their power, I'd say it's the Spanish, because they kind of laid the groundwork for all other colonial empires that followed. Also, the PLC is a very interesting empire, but a colonial power they were not. My favorite trade good in this game is paper and cloth, because they're really easy to get a lot of provinces that make them. But yeah, I would go for the Spanish there. They were the first out of the gate. They established an enormous colonial empire really, really fast. And they controlled it for longer than most. The Spanish Empire, although its heyday was over at the end of the 17th century, did last until the early 19th. I mean, they controlled... Yes, they did. There was a colony established by the Duchy of Kurland, but they were very small and were about as significant historically as the Swedish colonial empire, which did exist, however briefly, in Delaware. Yes, the American state that most people forget, except for the fact that it's kind of a tax haven within the country, was once a Swedish colony. Yep, actually, for those of you who aren't from the United States, if you look up a lot of American companies, you'll find that they're headquartered in Delaware. That's because Delaware has some of the most lax and easy tax laws in the entire country. I mean, you're not wrong. I thought you were asking in terms of who is the most effective at it. The amount of cruelty that the Spanish exacted upon the world is incredible. Same story with the British. But in terms of like who was a very effective colonizer, the British or Spaniards did it the most effectively. I would say with the French as a close second to them. Although the French had a very different tack when it came to how their colonization actually worked. Oh yeah, okay. But yeah, so the French actually kind of integrated a lot of native people into what they were building. Some of the what are the Black Legends? I'm unfamiliar with that term. I guess it probably depends on who you ask. The Indians would probably say the British were worse, but Native Americans would probably say the Spanish were worse, or the Americans. I mean, they did send a lot of native laborers to their deaths in silver mines in South America. All right, 100 Years' War is over. True, and a lot of that was unintentional, but what natives did survive were sent into the silver mines. The reason they imported Africans... Hmm? Hmm. Oh, what's going on here? Oh yeah, I don't usually bother with that. And I'll take that military power, thanks. I'm not an expert on that period. King Phil's. Let me. Let me look it up. It might ring a bell. Okay. Yes. Yes. This is ringing a bell. Hmm. Honestly, it's a tough call. Both the Spanish and the British were brutal. The thing about this game is I know the early part of it very well, like historically, late medieval into the Renaissance, but I'm a bit less well versed in like 18th, 19th century. But it's honestly a toss-up, I would say. Both empires were exceptionally brutal to all the people living under them. I will say that. Not the ones fought exclusively in the U.S. or in the Americas, but I would say that the seven Years' War was pretty nasty. 7 Years' War was honestly sort of a precursor to the World Wars. It was the first global conflict. True. But yeah, the 7 Years' War, if you just want to go in like combat fatalities, is probably the worst. But as you can see, it's not that dissimilar from what the First World War was in terms of who was actually involved in it. Right. Okay. That makes that I gotcha. The wars against the natives were extremely one-sided and extremely brutal. Alright. I have a lot of money. Let's build some things. Should upgrade some trade ports as well while I'm at it. Yes, but that was a Christian name, I believe. I've also heard it referred to as, sorry, 1 second. Other names include Metacom's War, Metacomet's War, Pimetacomet's Rebellion, or Metacom's Rebellion. So that must have been his Native American name. But I will be the first to, I do not claim to be an expert on that period in history. My wheelhouse is really sort of the last 0 AD to, my knowledge kind of starts to peter out around late 16th, early 17th century. Ah, I see. Well, that's really the key difference between how the British and the French colonized, where the British had some very strict racial laws in their colonial empire that the French just didn't have. It's actually why it's actually why a lot of French Canadians are mixed. I have some amounts of Native American blood in me through my French Canadian ancestors. All right. Oh, what's going on here? Yeah, the Puritans were pretty batshit, honestly. The Catholics just generally tried to convert the natives, whereas the Protestants did convert natives, but generally they just didn't want anything to do with them. Like, the French actively sent missions to the Iroquois and Huron. There's actually a great movie about it, although I'm blanking on the name, but I saw the movie in college. It was great. It was about a Jesuit missionary sent to spread the faith to an Iroquois tribe in upstate New York. And the Salem witch trials, which actually my sister went to school up in Massachusetts, so I have actually been to Salem and seen there's actually a museum dedicated to the witch trials. It's pretty wild. Do I help them? No. I don't help Provence, because I want to seize their territories. Oh yeah, I mean, Catholics were not treated all that well in early America either. I mean, my home state of Maryland was basically just kind of a dumping ground for Catholics that the British didn't want anything to do with. Got a lot of Irish. Okay. But I have a lot of Irish blood in me, so I'm quite familiar with how Catholics were treated in the U.S. I mean, hell, Catholics have been here since the foundation of the country, but the first and I believe only Catholic president was JFK, and he got shot. So, actually, no, I think Biden is technically Catholic, but every other president has been Protestant. Which makes sense. Protestants are the vast majority of America's religious population, but Catholics make up about 24-25% of the population. So you'd have thought there'd be more Catholic presidents. I mean, you're completely correct. Christopher Columbus was an Italian, and then the Spaniards were one of the most staunchly Catholic powers in Europe. But I come from a long line of French Catholic settlers in the New World. I think I've mentioned this here before, but I am, unfortunately, a distant relation of Justin Trudeau. Right, there is a theory that the Irish might have gotten here a very, very long time ago, largely by accident, but there are weird Celtic knots that show up in parts of Eastern America that nobody can really explain how the fuck they got here. Because that sort of artistic language doesn't show up in any Native American art. And also, I didn't know that. No comment. But no, through the Trudeau line, they're distant relations of my family. But you get a bunch of like insular French farmers living in roughly the same part of the world for centuries. There's going to be a lot of intermarriage between them. So French Canadians can pretty much all trace their lineage back to a small group of settlers that arrived in around Quebec and Montreal back in the 17th century. 16th, 17th, but my group eventually found their way down to that must have been an interesting marriage. But my group eventually found their way down to Vermont and then down to Baltimore. And then on my father's side, I've got a fair amount of German blood in me, and then both of them mixed with Irish. Actually, my earliest ancestors in sort of what is now the U.S., not just North America, as Canada, were actually mercenaries that came here during the Revolution to fight for the British, who defected and fought for the Revolution because at the time there was a standing bounty for any Germans who defected from the British, where they got an enlisted man got 25 acres of land and a officer got 50 acres. So my ancestors decided to, yep, Hessian mercenaries, although the family was from Prussia originally. They found their way to Hesse and then eventually came over here. Also, that is fascinating. I never knew that about Leif Erikson. But yeah, so my family is descended, at least my father's side is descended from German mercenaries who came here to fight in the Revolution, but who defected to fight for the infant United States, and then settled somewhere in Pennsylvania before coming down to Maryland. And then my Irish ancestry is much more recent. Both of them, all my Irish family got here in the 19th century, and then intermarried with French and German people who had been here for far longer. That is interesting. I never knew. I learned something new today. That is fascinating. I do know that Iceland has a weird history because of the Vikings, because it was a completely uninhabited island before the Vikings arrived. There was no native human population before that. But anyway, so my dad's family was actually Lutheran. They were Lutheran Germans for a very long time. until my great-grandfather married an Irish Catholic girl and converted for her. Also, I do know that the Vikings did get here before, when they were still almost entirely pagan. Also, I'm going to pause and pour myself some more whiskey. I love this whiskey. The bottle is just impossible to pour out of. But if you're looking for a good one to drink, I thoroughly recommend the Sexton, which is an Irish whiskey. Don't exactly know off the top of my head who makes it, but I can't recommend it enough. It's at the same price point as like your Jameson or your Bushmills, but it's much higher quality. There is no better bang for your buck Irish whiskey out there. Right, I got you. I mean, there were probably some accidental arrivals in America well before the Vikings, but you are correct that he was the first one who properly charted it. Granted, those charts were lost, and the Vikings kind of forgot that it existed too. But no, the Sexton is just a beautiful, beautiful whiskey. Because for the price, you really cannot beat it. It's just, my only gripe is that bottle is a pain to pour from. I did go to war with the English. I'm just waiting for that to be, I'm trying to integrate my vassals, and then I've got truces with everyone I can really go after right now. Yeah, they kind of accidentally found it. But I will say, with this stream, usually what happens is the closer we get to the end of it, the more it becomes less EU4 and more just full-blown historical ranting. I really should probably add, like, history chat into the title or something like that, because that's a lot of what this stream ends up being. But I figure I do my series, and they're usually, like, 12 or so episodes long. So that's what I'm talking about for pretty much a whole year. So why not have some time where people can just ask, like, we can just talk history more freeform and kind of talk about whatever the hell we want to. Because I love talking about history, and I will talk history with anyone. The number of times that Lady Renegade has had to, like, grab my arm and make me stop ranting to people we just met is... Oh, you probably would expect it's been quite a number of times. Because I love history so much, I'm not always good at picking up when other people are kind of tired of talking about it. Because, well, how could you be tired of talking about history? It's the most fascinating subject out there to me. I'm still waiting for the day that someone gets what this shirt is about. It's a list of all of Flavius Belisarius' battles during his military career. Nobody's gotten it yet, but I hold out hope that one day someone will. Because more people need to know who Belisarius was. He was a fucking badass. But yeah, thankfully my girlfriend is much better at knowing when people have grown bored of a subject than I am. Because she will sometimes be like, they don't love history as much as we do. Maybe switch to a different subject. And I'm usually mystified. Like, well, how in hell would I talk about anything else? And I'm the exact same way. My historical fascination... Yes, he was. He was a Eastern Roman general who almost single-handedly restored the Western Empire to it. And had he been given wider leeway by Justinian, we might all be speaking Greek right now. But Theodora didn't trust him. She thought he would try to seize the throne himself. But no, my historical obsession began when I was very little, and my dad bought me my first book on Egyptian history. That's kind of how I get sometimes. But when I believe I was 6 or 7, my dad bought me a book on Egyptian history, and I was fucking hooked. Because from that point, I just couldn't. I had to read something else. And also, I'm joking, but it was Eastern Rome, and Justinian was the last emperor to use Latin over Greek. So, in all likelihood, the empire would have switched to Greek eventually. But no, after I read that book on Egypt, I was fucking hooked. And then I devoured everything I could. About every different period. The medieval era was always an obsession for me. And yeah, that is also true. Justinian was just an emperor who spoke Latin largely. But the daily language for most of the people living in the Eastern Empire was Greek. You know, you're good. But yeah, so I just ever since I was a little kid, I have been in love with the study of history. And I mean, I grew up when the History Channel was still good. Before it became like all Nazis, aliens, and Pawn Stars. That documentary, well, the documentary series, Engineering an Empire, that was my shit when I was a kid. I watched that on repeat. If you've never heard of it, I'm posting it in the chat now because you need to know about this. It is awesome. The best episode was easily Rome, Engineering an Empire. And it was hosted by fucking RoboCop. That's how awesome this is. Let me see if I can find it. It's gotta be. I found it on... Yeah. Circa 2005, back when the History Channel was still good, they put out this series of documentaries about how ancient civilizations did their engineering. Watch it. It is 1,001% worth some time. Yeah. God, History Channel was so good in the early 2000s. But then Ancient Aliens happened, and then shit got weird. Because fake history about how aliens did everything apparently sells better than actual fucking history, which is beyond depressing as someone who has spent his life studying history. No, aliens did not build the fucking pyramids. That is the most brain-dead take I have heard in... Well, probably, aside from, like, Flat Earth theory, that is one of the most brain-dead takes I've heard in my entire life. Which is tragic. More kids needed to get their... More kids' dads needed to buy them books on Egyptology. That's how I got started. Because my dad is also a bit of a low-key history geek, although he mostly loves World War II and the like. And his dad was the same way. Ignatius Donnelly. I've never heard that name. I gotcha. Yep. Yep. But, right. Oh, Jesus. Atlantis is another fucking stupid theory. Well, here's the thing that... Going to flat earth theory for a moment, here's the thing that fucking gets me about that. We've known the earth has been round since the Greeks. The ancient Greeks calculated the circumference of the earth within a few hundred meters, which is pretty fucking good considering they were working on pencil and paper. And then some jackass is like, maybe it's flat, and then everyone just rolls with that. Thing is, even into the medieval era, most people knew the earth was round. Columbus thought the earth was round. That wasn't like a revolutionary idea. He just thought it was half the size that it actually is. But a lot of people thought the earth was round throughout most of Western history because we've known it's been round since the Greeks calculated the circumference of it. Flat Earth theory is a really recent development that only really got popularized in like 19th century America. It's fucking bizarre to me. Because everyone knew the earth was round. Since I forget exactly what year it was done, but the Greeks calculated the rough circumference of the earth well before the birth of Christ. Yeah, that was the one that they got wrong, but you can understand, like, you can understand how, looking just from Earth, you might guess where the center of the universe, just because everything is observed from an Earth point of view. But actually, the thing that got Galileo in trouble wasn't that he thought the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. It's that he kind of blasphemed the Pope. That's what actually got him in trouble. Because the thing most people don't realize about the Catholic Church is it's one of the greatest patrons of science throughout human history. I mean, the Papal Academy of Sciences is still a major scientific institution. And actually, the person who first put forward the Big Bang Theory was a Catholic priest. Georges Lemaitre. I probably butchered that pronunciation. Yeah, Georges Lemaitre. He was a Belgian priest who lived from 1894 to 1966. He put forward Big Bang Theory, and he was laughed at it for the time, but he's pretty much been proven right. But no, the Catholic Church was historically one of the main patrons of science in Europe. And the Papal Academy of Sciences is still a very respected scientific institution. And the medieval era was far from a dark age. Technology continued progressing. Maybe at a slower rate, but it continued progressing. Yeah, it's fucking stupid. The Catholic Church was one of the most pro-science organizations in pre-modern Europe. A lot of great scientists were Catholic monks. Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, Catholic monk. Yeah, he was an Augustinian friar. Yeah, father of genetics. That entire field of study began with him. And yeah, Francis Bacon, devout Catholic. Although he might have been an Anglican, but close enough. Anyway, yeah, Gregor Mendel was the father of genetics and a Catholic priest. Don't believe anyone who tells you that the Catholic Church held Europe back scientifically, because it was the main patron of the science in Europe. I am really far behind on Diplotech. In part, so the phrase Dark Ages has been associated with the whole of the medieval period in Europe. And yeah, churches in general have been... They get such a bad rap, even though they've largely patronized science. But yeah, so... And yeah, I know I'm largely speaking from a Catholic standpoint, because that's what I'm familiar with. I am Catholic, I was raised Catholic, I went to Catholic school, so we learned a lot about all of this. So, you know, the Orthodox Church did a similar thing in Eastern Europe, and most of the Protestant churches did as well. But, so yeah, the phrase Dark Ages has been associated with the whole of the medieval era, but that's just not the case. And the phrase Dark Age has largely been poisoned by it. So all a Dark Age means is that people aren't writing things down. So there was actually a Greek Dark Age prior to the Greek Classical era. And also, yeah, the Islamic religion did a huge amount to further mathematics in particular during their golden age. But so all a Dark Age means is that we don't have much in the way of written sources on it. So there was, and I would agree with that, scientism is the religion of the modern day. But so there was a Greek Dark Age wherein very little was being written down, and it actually was it came before classical Greece, which is the age of like Athens and Sparta that most people think of. But so there was a Dark Age following the end of the Western Roman Empire in 476. But that largely comes to an end with the rise of the Frankish Empire a couple of centuries later. And actually, in the 8th century, you have what's called the Carolingian Renaissance, where Charlemagne's dynasty leads to a massive resurgence in art and architecture and literature and science in medieval Europe. And then you have other brief periods of Renaissance throughout the medieval period. And then you have the big Renaissance, which is the one everyone is familiar with in the 15th century. But no, I'm with you there. I think scientism has become a religion in the absence of religions. Because as much as we like to think ourselves different from our Stone Age ancestors, we really are not. We are still the same old monkeys, basically. There's not as much distance between us and the cavemen as we'd like to imagine. I look at it this way: we are still running Stone Age operating system on some pretty outdated hardware. It's weird how the people who developed the scientific method would not want you to just slavishly believe everything scientists say. Now, certainly somebody who has studied science their whole life has a lot more credibility to their scientific opinion, but scientists can be wrong. And throughout history, many have been wrong. I mean, eugenics was viewed as a completely scientific movement for a long time. Further back, for a long time, scientific knowledge was that the Earth was the center of the universe. And then science changes over time as it's challenged. If you don't challenge science, science doesn't progress. Science needs to be challenged. It needs to constantly reevaluate itself. So if you just slavishly accept everything scientists say, science won't progress. Science is... The foundation of science is questioning everything around you. It's a problem though, because with religion declining around the world, or at least in the West, I don't see this changing anytime soon. So scientism is probably here to stay. And actually, you know, the Catholic Church never formally opposed evolution. That was largely young Earth creationists in the United States that were dead set against it. The Catholic Church was open to the idea being true. And they participated in the dialogue around evolution. That is true. It's kind of, I think people need something beyond themselves that they can... I don't know if worship is the right word, but yeah, we do. We humanity always has time not to fuck things up, but as a species, we're pretty good at fucking things up. But we're also pretty good at improvising our way out of our fuck-ups. So I think we'll be okay. I hope we'll be okay, but I do think we'll be okay. I think things are going to be weird for a while, but it'll be okay. And that is, Buddhism is interesting because it's almost an atheistic religion. I'm not an expert on Buddhism. I'm relatively well versed in it because I had to study it in my learning on Chinese history. But I'm not an expert on it. But I am... Alan Watts is one of my favorite philosophers, and he touches heavily on the ideas of Buddhism, Taoism in particular, and Hinduism. And we've really lost our sense of the mystical in our age of scientific objectivism. And I think that's something important for humans to have. We kind of lose our minds a little bit otherwise. If there's one thing humans are good at, though, it's adapting and improvising. I mean, you can even see this in Catholicism, and this is an issue that's pretty near and dear. I am a big fan of old school Catholicism in the sense of like using Latin in Mass and Gregorian chants and the like. And without that, I think the Catholic Church has lost something key to its existence. Because we've Catholic monasticism and mysticism has really declined since Vatican II. And I think it's been to the detriment of Catholicism as a religion. But you are correct that nuclear weapons could end all life on Earth tomorrow, but... And yeah, Dracula is... He's been changed significantly. Oh, the Provence has been excommunicated. Is my truce up with them? Brabant and Liege. My truce is up with them. Alright, excommunication war. Let's go. Actually, speaking of Dracula, Any of you guys seen the Castlevania Netflix series? A video game adaptation has no right to be that fucking good. I just finished watching the 4th season. Oh my god, what an end. Also, yeah, Dracula is horrific in the actual original Bram Stoker novel. But no, Castlevania is such a good series, and a video game adaptation has no right to be that good, but it was incredible. Most video game adaptations are fucking horrible, but that one, I just got lost in it. I was like, Dracula is a very interesting book. The original Bram Stoker version. And Bram Stoker was an interesting fucking guy. I know there is in Crusader Kings. I don't think there is in EU4. Because there is a vampirism mod in Crusader Kings. Actually, I should set up here so I can eradicate their army. Besides, I need to wait until my armies are ready to attack. Also, this is a... Oh, it doesn't seem to be working. Oh well. I have a roads mod. That's actually a lot of fun to fuck around with. Good for role-playing. So, in this run, in sort of north of the Pyrenees, my goal is to expand to the Rhine River. Expand France to her natural borders, a la Napoleon. But then I'm also going to conquer Catalonia and restore Charlemagne's Spanish March. Interesting. That is an interesting take on Dracula that I hadn't considered, but that is very good. Actually, I would love to go see the historical castle of Vlad Tepes in Romania. Actually, Romania is pretty high on my list of countries I would love to visit. Though I think once if this COVID bullshit is over at some point, I think my next trip is going to be Austria, Czechia, and Hungary and Poland. Because those have been on my list for a very long time. I would love to see them. Oh yeah, well, a lot of the cool shit has unfortunately become tourist traps, but what can you really do? I have wanted to see Vienna for the longest time. And then Budapest and Prague as well. And then I really want to see Krakow, Warsaw, and I cannot pronounce the Polish, so I'm going to call it Danzig in Poland. That is so high on my list of places to visit. Also, Yen, people hear Vlad Draculest and then they think of Dracula, even though that's not exactly correct. But no, I'm gonna take Verdun. I'll take that stability hit. It's fine. But no, Vienna is so high on my list of cities I really need to see before I die. I've been to a decent chunk of Europe, and yeah, that is true. It's just that a lot of people associate them because Romania and Transylvania, which actually isn't even... Vlad Tepes ruled over Wallachia, and Transylvania is here. So that's the other funny thing to me, is that people associate Vlad the Impaler with a region he never had any connection to historically. Because this region in what is Eastern Hungary in this era, is Transylvania. That is true. Well, Son of the Dragon is a pretty fucking badass name, I will say. Because that's what Draculest means. True, it's not that rare. It's just fucking cool. I think it's the thing. Yeah, a lot of Hungarians are still pissed about the Treaty of Trianon, which cut Hungary down to just the ethnic Hungarian regions. But there is still a pocket of Hungarians living in Transylvania and in southern Slovakia, which is actually what the fascist Hungarians used in World War II as justification for seizing those territories. I think Hungary was penalized too hard because they didn't really have any option in going to war for the Central Powers. They were kind of under Austrian rule at the time, so the Hungarian men who served for the Austro-Hungarian army didn't have a whole lot of option or a whole lot of choice in the matter. Yeah, supposedly, but the region that was important to Vlad historically was Wallachia. I think, my perception as an American is that Poland is also up there. In terms of nationalism. I mean, I think nationalism has become a dirty word, when in reality everyone should be, to a small degree, a national. You should be proud of your country. You should be happy to be a part of your country. Like, I'm not blindly gonna follow America everywhere, because America has made mistakes in the past, but I am proud of America, and I do love America. Yeah, I'm not an expert in Eastern Europe, but I will say I think everyone should, to a degree, be a bit of a nationalist. Not like a hardcore conquering your country kind of thing, but patriotism is healthy and it shouldn't be discouraged. And yeah, I do completely agree with you there. It gets tricky, and but I think there's something to be said for believing in your country and being a patriot in your country, because if a country doesn't believe it's good, then why should that country exist anymore? You can't lose faith in what your country is. And I think the founding values of America are good. And I love what this country was founded on. I love what this country has historically been. And yeah, they did have some self-rule, but they were still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, Austro-Hungary the Austro-Hungarian Empire did exist. It was just a very unstable, disjointed empire. But no, I think everyone should. I guess unless your country's doing something objectively evil, you should, to a degree, love your country. Like, not to the point of hating other people, but a healthy love of your own country is a good thing. It's like, I can love America without hating people from the rest of the world. And that is true, yeah. The Hungarians did want self-rule for a very long time. Yeah, France is in a very interesting place, and I hope that I love France, and I loved my time there. So I hope they get their shit figured out, because France is an awesome country. I think being a patriot is a good thing. Because you can be a patriot and love your country without hating other countries. I think too many people just conflate nationalism with Nazism, and they're just not the same thing. It was never federalized, but there were plans to federalize it, which would have been pretty wild if it had actually happened. Actually, the man who got shot, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was a major proponent for federalizing Austria-Hungary into a sort of... And yeah, Austria-Hungary was a bizarre country. But yeah, it's like... Every country has good things in its past, and every country has bad things in its past. But every country has something good that can be said for it. So I think everyone should be a patriot to a degree. So Gavrilo Princip was a Serbian nationalist, and he wanted a unified Serbian nation. The problem was the Austro-Hungarian Empire controlled a lot of what was northern Serbia. So he was part, and yeah, I would go along with that. Sort of like how the Kalmar Union was really three countries under one king, or how Spain was really Castile and Aragon under one monarch until it was formally unified into Spain. So I'll go along with that, that Austria-Hungary was really two countries sharing a king. But Gavrilo Princip was part of a Serbian nationalist group called, I believe it was like the Black Hand or something like that, or like Death's Hand, or some absurdly sinister name that you wouldn't think would exist but did. So they took out their nationalistic fury on the one man who was actually advocating for them within the empire. And actually, the initial attempt on his life failed. They tried to throw a grenade into his car, but the roof was up and it bounced off the top. And then Gavrilo Princip, disappointed that his assassination attempt had failed, decided to go get a sandwich at his favorite cafe. And after he'd finished eating his lunch, he walked outside, and whose fucking car was in front of him but the Archduke's? So he took his opportunity, drew his pistol, and shot him. And had he known what he was about to kick off, I wonder if he would have done it. Yeah, Gavrilo Princip is one of those weird guys from history who just... Here you go. This is him. Gavrilo Princip. Serbian/Yugoslav nationalist who wanted to do away with Austro-Hungarian rule over Serbia. Or the Serbian people. And yeah, the initial assassination attempt failed, so he was sad. So he went to get a sandwich. He went to get comfort food, and in a bizarre stroke of luck on his part and unluck for everyone else in Europe, the Archduke happened to stop outside of that cafe. Yeah, I think this is his mugshot, actually. I think this is his mugshot from Austro-Hungarian prison. Yeah, he does. But, yeah, that is his mugshot. Gavrilo Princip, the Serbian Florida man. That's beautiful. No, he was one of those weird fucking guys who just turns up throughout history and manages to change the course of it. I don't think he ever wanted this to... if he had known... And yeah, he was only 19 years old. So, I wonder if he'd known what his actions would kick off. Like, if someone had let him know that his assassination of Franz Ferdinand would have led to the deaths of millions of people, would he have still done it? Because I consider World War II to be a direct result of World War I. So I consider that World War II also was kind of in the cards as soon as Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. So I wonder if he'd known just the sheer millions of people who would die as a direct result of his actions. Would he have still done it? Because you got to consider all the deaths of World War II. Because you don't get World War II without World War I. Although really, I blame Woodrow Wilson for a lot of the fuckery that happened in Europe post-World War I. That is true, because millions of Serbians did die because, I mean... One of the more forgotten things that happened during World War II is that the Nazis set up a fascist state in Croatia that started ethnically cleansing Serbs. So yeah, he probably wouldn't have done it if you told him that the Croats would wind up killing a bunch of fucking Serbs. But no, fuck Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson sucks. One of the worst presidents of the 20th century. Pretty much all of the bad shit that happened in World War II. Also, I am aware of that. I am looking into getting some soundproofing for this room. Yeah, when I talk about history, I don't like referring to it as like a chain of cause and effect. Oh yeah, Wilson was super fucking racist. Even Wilson was racist by the standards of the 1910s and 1920s, which is saying something. But yeah, so when I talk about history, I don't like to think of it as a chain of cause and effect. History is more like a web than a thread. You pull on one strand and it picks up 5 or 6 others. There's no singular cause and effect. You know, Woodrow Wilson was shitty from start to finish. He was one of the worst presidents in American history. I will simp for Calvin Coolidge until the day I die. Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal, was one of the best fucking presidents in American history because he didn't do anything. Silent Cal just didn't do anything. He let the country do what it was gonna do. And the Roaring Twenties happened as a direct result of his hands-off approach. Calvin Coolidge is one of the most underrated presidents in American history because not only did he lead to one of the greatest economic booms in American history, he also signed a bill granting all Native American citizenship. Teddy Roosevelt is also a really great president, but Calvin Coolidge is so underrated. Coolidge is the reason that Native Americans got citizenship, because prior to him they weren't considered citizens. Reagan was pretty good, but I think Calvin Coolidge was the greatest president of the 20th century. Yeah, I'll take that admin power hit. That's fine. Yes, Grant was a fucking awesome, badass president. Yeah, Nixon policy-wise was alright. It's the the fact that he was a total fucking crook. Granted, most politicians are crooks regardless of party or ideology. See, here's the thing that most people don't get about... I assume my politicians are scumbag. Eisenhower was pretty good. He's a large part of why schools were integrated in America. Eisenhower was a pretty great president. I like Ike. I still like Ike. But also, yeah, Grant was a pretty fucking great general, too. Lee is good but overrated as a general. He is not as good as, like, the Lost Causers would like you to believe, but he was pretty competent. Now, granted, most of the battles he was fighting were against McClellan, who was one of the most hilariously incapable generals in American history. So, I wonder, I think it's less of a case of Lee being good and just McClellan being that bad. Yes, I will take all of Provence's territory, thank you very much. Yeah, Lee was good in an individual battle, but if you wanted to win a war, he was not your man. Yeah, Lee was the sort of guy you would want in charge of an individual battle, not a total, not the whole war. Because he won most of the battles he fought, but he wound up losing the war. Also true, Stonewall Jackson, I would argue, was the better general of the two. Which I actually, so when I got my job, I originally started doing historical research on the buildings my company owns in Baltimore. And I found that one of the people who lived in one of these buildings was a very prominent figure in the Confederacy. So I found out that she had personal correspondence with Stonewall Jackson during the Civil War. And all the Confederate generals are overrated, just bar none. But I found out that Stonewall Jackson spoke fluent Spanish, which is interesting. No, all of the Confederate generals are overrated by the Lost Causer types. Well, where have we got a revolt brewing? I know, so I will send you guys here. Cavalry general. Are you thinking of Pershing? I think Pershing is one of the greatest generals in American history. Pershing had such an eye for talent. Pershing was the whole reason that Eisenhower and Patton were where they were during World War II. I actually wrote a... Here we go. Blackjack Pershing. Fucking badass. He is one of my favorite figures from American history. I wrote a whole article about him. Y'all gotta learn about General Patton. He had such an eye for talent. He fast-tracked the careers of Dwight D. Eisenhower, of Patton, and of Isaiah Bradley, who were three of the best American generals of World War II. So the whole reason they were where they were during World War II was because Patton saw the potential they had. He was also very ahead of his time as far as the integration of the Army. Rommel was also pretty good, I will say. As a general. And yeah, Patton and Montgomery did not get along in the slightest. Granted, Patton was an exceptionally abrasive personality. Benjamin Grierson. I'm not familiar. Let me look him up real quick. What was he serving in? Oh, the Buffalo Soldier. So the Buffalo Soldier Regiment was actually the same regiment that Pershing, or sorry, I'm thinking of Pershing. Pershing got his start in. Pershing was in charge of a group of soldiers in the Buffalo Soldier Regiment. I will do some more reading on him, though. He seems pretty cool. Yeah, Stonewall was good, but there were far better generals during the Civil War. Montgomery was pretty damn good as a general too. Actually, a lot of the Allied generals are kind of underrated because I think a lot of the Nazi generals get more sort of popular coverage than their ally counterparts. Because a lot of people will still talk about Heinz Guderian or Rommel, but actually de Gaulle doesn't get enough credit. De Gaulle saw what the Germans were doing, and he wanted... If the French army had listened to de Gaulle prior to World War II, they might have fared better. But they didn't at all. Because the French military at the time had this whole thing where the longer you were in, the more sway you had. So they weren't going to listen to a young general like de Gaulle, even though he was completely correct about how the French tanks ought to be deployed against the Germans. And also, that is true. World War II is one of the most popular alt history jumping off points. Yeah, Guderian had his issues, but he was a rather effective tank commander. Most of the German generals were one-trick ponies, though. They were only good when they had armor superiority. Yeah, no, they were all hateable, but they were rather effective if they had armored superiority, and they were very good at breakthrough blitzkrieg tactics. Rommel was, in my opinion, the true visionary in terms of sort of German tacticians during World War II. Rommel was brilliant. Both in No, Rommel was brilliant both in terms of his tank tactics and his infantry tactics. Rommel basically wrote the book on modern small squad infantry tactics. A lot of his are still used in modern warfare. Rommel was a very capable general who wasn't listened to as much as he ought to have been if the Germans actually wanted to win the war. Granted, Hitler was the greatest gift the Allies received because he was such a fucking nutbar who didn't listen to his military commanders. He didn't listen to the people who actually really knew what they were doing and how to win a war. Like, Hitler had been a soldier during World War I, but he was pretty far from like a brilliant commander or anything. He was a effective politician and demagogue, but he wasn't a military leader. Yeah. He was an effective soldier, but he was not an effective leader at all. Like, he was a very effective politician, but yeah, D-Day probably shouldn't have worked. It did by a stroke of luck and the precursors to the Army Rangers, but similar to D-Day was the Gallipoli landings, and if the Gallipoli landings were any indication, D-Day shouldn't have worked, but it did. I mean, the Gallipoli landings almost cost Winston Churchill his career. They were his idea, and they failed miserably. Yeah, Goering was a fucking idiot. But also that is true. D-Day was because Stalin was really pushing for some kind of a relief on him on the Eastern Front, but D-Day really should not have worked if you looked at the previous attempt at Gallipoli. Truth is, a lot of the German generals were assholes. They were competent, but they were dickheads, and they didn't work well together. Rommel was genuinely effective, though, at pretty much in pretty much any sort of terrain or sort of warfare he was participating in. He was an effective commander. His men loved him and were willing to follow him to the ends of the earth. True, but Omaha was the hardest point. Actually, if you go to northern France, check out Pointe du Hoc, which is actually where the Army Rangers were born. So there were these giant anti-ship cannons that the Germans had set up at Pointe du Hoc in Normandy. And before the D-Day landings could take place, those needed to be taken out. So a unit that would later become the Army Rangers, who their motto is first in, last out. They're a bunch of fucking badasses as far as I'm concerned. They rappelled up these sheer cliffs and took this gun position by just sheer force, drove the Germans out, and that allowed the ships to get close enough to support the D-Day landings. Otherwise, these massive anti-ship cannons would have ripped the Allied naval support to shreds. And then that unit would go on to become the Army Rangers. And then they actually, I don't know if any of you have ever seen Normandy. As soon as you're off the beach, like as soon as you're inland, there are these huge hedgerows that were actually trouble for tanks to get through. So the Allies had a hell of a time actually pressing through inland Normandy because even the tanks had difficulty getting through these massive hedgerows. And sometimes an Allied group of soldiers would be on one side of the hedges and they knew a group of Germans was on the other and they couldn't get at them because these hedges were so thick that even tanks couldn't get through them. Well, there were a lot of dumb maneuvers on both sides of World War II that probably shouldn't have worked, but by sheer luck did. Like, honestly, if the French had pressed into Germany harder in the opening stages of World War II, it might have been over in 39. Because the French did manage to progress a little into German territory in 39, but they didn't press further, which is what killed them. And yes, Stalingrad was a massive mistake on the part of the Germans. But the thing about Stalingrad you need to consider is that was an ego thing. Hitler wanted to take the city that bore Stalin's name, and Stalin refused to give up the city that bore his name. So that was an ego thing on both their parts. Though, Vasily Zaitsev was a fucking badass no matter which way you cut it. One of the deadliest snipers in history, and his tactics are still used today. Alright, integrated all of Provence's territory. Do I take the Knights as an ally? Do I? Yeah, the Italians wound up being nothing more than a liability for the Germans in World War II, but that was the... And yeah, he spent most of the Luftwaffe fighting the Brits over England, which was a massive failure. But part of that was Goering was completely overconfident in his Luftwaffe. They were good. They weren't as good as Goering thought they were. Greece didn't affect Barbarossa that much, but Italy in general was a massive liability for the Germans. Because when the Allies started pressing into Sicily and southern Italy, the Germans did have to send support to stop their southern flank from collapsing completely. So Italy wound up being more of a liability than anything else, which honestly the Germans should have seen coming, given that Italy was a liability for the Central Powers during World War I. Yeah, it's alarming how close the Germans came to success in the Eastern Front. That is one of the truly terrifying alt history scenarios, is what if Barbarossa had gone more smoothly? Yeah, the Italians built decent planes, but their tanks were nothing to write home about. The Japanese too, honestly. The Japanese built some great... Like, the Mitsubishi Zero was a great fighter, circa 39-40. Their tanks were terrible, and then they didn't upgrade the Zero to the point where it was actually an effective fighting machine late war. Actually, the Zero stopped being effective when the Americans captured a intact Zero that had crashed and found out they had a huge weak spot right behind the cockpit. So the Zero had one critical weakness. It was a very effective fighter otherwise, but the Zero did not have a rubberized gas tank. So shots to the gas tank could cause it to ignite and cause the plane to go down in flames, which is exactly what the Americans started doing as soon as they learned that was a weak point that the Zero had. They would aim right behind the cockpit, and if you hit the fuel tank, you could cause the whole plane to ignite. So that's what American pilots started doing in the Pacific Theater to great effect. And then the Japanese didn't have the time and resources to develop a better Zero. Well, yeah, Stalin's purges are the main reason the Red Army did not fight effectively in World War II. Um, Stalin purged most of the generals that knew what the fuck they were doing. Well, it's there. There was a French tank joke. I heard that those new French tanks. They have 6-speed transmissions, 1 forward and 5 in reverse. One of the best digs at the French I've ever heard was from Top Gear, where Jeremy Clarkson referred to them as cheese-eating surrender monkeys. Which got a chuckle out of me, even though the French soldiers during World War II were an army of lions led by sheep. The individual French soldier fought like hell. It was his commanders that let him down. Also, that is true. The Soviets thought they were secure because they had an alliance with the Nazis. But no, and it's Alexander the Great put it correctly when he said, I would rather fight an army of sheep led by a lion than an army of lions led by sheep. And that was exactly what the French army was during World War II. There is no way you can disregard the sheer valor of individual French soldiers in World War II. Those men fought heroically. It's just their leadership was so horrible. They weren't effective. De Gaulle was one of the few French generals that actually knew what the fuck he was doing, and he wasn't caught up in trying to fight the last war. But they only listened to the old guard who were still fighting World War I. And because of that, a lot of very good French soldiers lost their lives. Also, that is true. Stalin didn't trust Hitler, but he kind of thought he was secure given the pacts they had signed previous to that, like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But no, you can't discount the bravery and individual fighting skill of the individual French soldier. It's a tragedy they were led by such fucking morons. It still pisses me off that they didn't listen to de Gaulle prior to World War II, because if they had listened to de Gaulle, World War II would have gone differently, because the French would actually have been prepared and known how to deploy their tanks to counter the Germans. True, but a lot of the French generals who were worth anything were not around anymore. Also, that he probably did expect Hitler to attack him, but he probably expected he would go after France first, which, honestly, it could have gone either way. Hitler hated both the Soviets and the French, probably to equal degrees. So I really couldn't say, but... And honestly, I think he would have expected a German attack later than it came. I think both the Soviets and the Nazis knew they would have to fight each other at some point. But I think they both expected that... I think the Soviets expected the Nazis would go after the French first. And the English too. So I don't think the Nazis would have really... Or I don't think the Soviets would have really been worried about the Nazis until they had cleared out both the English and the French. And I don't think the Soviets saw the Nazis beating the English, because there was no way in hell the Nazis were going to be able to gain naval superiority. They had a handful of really good ships, like Gneisenau, Graf Spee, Scharnhorst, and Bismarck, but that was nothing compared to the sheer might of the British Navy. Also, on that note, I think I am going to call it for the night. I am getting kind of tired. It's been a pretty long day. So I think I'm going to sign off. I will see you all next Friday for the next stream. This is Renegade Historian signing off. Have a great evening, everybody.